Okay, we are just about to start the new Mishnah on Daf Mem Hey Amud Aleph. Okay, Zogt the Heilige Mishnah. Kotche Oyevdei Kechavim Ein Chayovin Aleim Mishum Pigel Noiser V'Tamei. If you have the Kotchim of a goy, meaning a goy donated a korban, Rashi says Mefarish B'Gemara Ucheshes Nadvum L'Gvoya Klam. We're speaking about Kochim that a goy gave to the Beis Hamikdash. He decided that he wanted to bring a korban. Ein chayovin aleim mishum pigel noisar v'tami v'ashoich lemechutz potter. And also shchutei chutz is not an issue with korbanos that a goy brought. Divrei Rab Shimon. Rabbi Yosy mechayev. Rabbi Yosy holds no. All the halachas that apply to the korban brought by a yid equally apply to the korban brought by a goy. Tan Rabbanan. Kochei oyevdei kechavim. You're not allowed to have enough from them, but there's no din me'ila on them, unlike a korban that was brought by a yid. If you try making a tamura with an animal that was given as a korban by a goy, it doesn't work. They don't bring nesachim either. So normally, so the end of it means, Rashi says, shemisnav b'fnei atmon v'loy zevach ki Yisrael shemisnav v'miyayin. A yid could just donate nesachim only. That's what a goy doesn't do. But if a goy brings a korban, like every other korban, it does have to be accompanied with yayin. Avol korban to nesachim divrei Rab Shimon. Amar Rabbi Yosy, Zok Rabbi Yosy. All these halachas that Reb Shimon says does not apply, I hold they do apply. Shenemar bahen lashem. It says lashem. Okay, so now we have the first taste of the first limud that Rabbi Yosy offers up. So let's have a look at the word lashem in the pasuk. Let's see lashem. Daber al aharon ve'elbonav ve'elkol b'nei Yisrael ve'mart alem ish, and from the double lashon of ish we learn to be marba even a goy mi beis Yisrael u'minager v'Yisrael asher Yaakov imedu l'chol reim l'chol advosav asher yakrivu l'Hashem l'oila. So therefore that tells us that they're included, as Rashi says. The chsiv ish b'beis Yisrael v'dashinin b'akal shaychten ish ma'atamadamar ish l'rabbis as ha'ivdei kachavim shenoidrim nidorim u'nidavos ke Yisrael. Gewaltig. Ba'medavar ma'murim zok Rashi the ein moyalim ben also the Tanna Kama, very important. So that the Tanna Kama Rab Shimon says that ein moyalim ben is only because mizbeach. That's if they needed a korban. Abu b'kachim b'edek habayis moyalim ben. But if they just donated the Bedek Habayis, there they have the same din me'ilah on something anonymous that a goy donated to Bedek Habayis as there would be if a yid donated it to Bedek Habayis. So, just to be clear, we have a machlokes between Rabbi Yosy and Reb Shimon by Kotchei Aguf, by Korbanos, but by Bedek Habayis, everyone holds the din me'ilah. Sorry? Because we don't have special psukim. Normally, Bedek Habayis is money that belongs to Hektish, and that has a din me'ilah, and there's no limudim to exclude that of a goy. But there are limudim to exclude that of a goy by Kotchei Aguf. The Gemara is going to bring psukim. So this is all psukim. Zogt Gemara loy nehenin v'loy me'alim. Loy nehenin is only midrabanan. So l'chila you shouldn't have enough from it. But v'loy me'alim, if somebody had enough from a korban, an animal that was given as a korban by a goy, there would not be a din of me'ilah. Why? The Gomar me'ilah chet mitru. There is a gzer shava by me'ilah. The Torah uses the word chet, and by truma the Torah uses the word chet. And then the betruma ksiv b'nei Yisrael v'lo ovdei kechavim. So when it comes time to me'ilah, we learn me'ilah from chet. So let's have a look at the pasuk where these are quoted. Nefesh kisimo mal v'chatasa b'shkoga. So there's a word chet used in conjunction with the Isra Me'ilah, and then it says by truma V'shamru es mishmarti v'lo yisu olav chet umesu b'ki chalalu. This is the famous pasuk that says that a zar who eats truma or a tamei who eats truma will be chayiv misa b'dei shemayim. So the word chet mentioned by truma and the word chet mentioned by me'ilah bring the two in yonim together, and therefore, just like by truma, where it says b'nei Yisrael, who didn't by me'ilah, the parsha of me'ilah does not apply to oivdei kechavim, but that's lagabe karbonai, that's lagabe kedusha saguf. Vein chayav and alav mishum pigel noiser v'tamei. So we know why you're not chayav, because of me'ilah. There's a special pasuk. How do we extend to say that not only does the korban of a guy not have me'ilah, but it's not subject to these other isurim as well? My timer, the also pigol avoin minoisar. We already learned that the v'nos avoin by pigol and the v'nos avoin by noisar blends them together. But also noisar chilul mituma, and noisar is compared to tuma because it uses the word chilul. Ubetomaksiv and lagabe the isur of tum and karbonis. The pasuk says b'nei Yisrael v'lo oivdei kechavim. This is really what we started with a couple of days ago. That we learned from Tumah that it applies, that just like Tumah applies to all types of kochim, so too Noiser and Pigel does, because Tumah exports it to Noiser, and then Noiser, thank you so much, further exports it to Pigel. So therefore, they all share the same halacha, and another halacha shared is this halacha that we learned today, that it does not apply to that of a guy. Zogt the heilige Gemara weiter, the ein oisin temura. My timer. Where does the halacha of temura join this party? So far we've covered me'ilah, we've covered me'ilah, we've covered noisor, and we've covered pigol. Now we want to know how we know there's no temura. My timer, again, the iskish temura l'maisha behema. Temura is comparable to maisha behema, and maisha behema, the iskish. The iskish temura l'maisha behema, maisha behema iskish l'maisha dogon. Maisha behema is compared to maisha dogon in the pasuk, and therefore. So let's have a look at these psukim over here. In my Torah Shalom, it's Tes and Yud. So in pasuk identified as Tes, it says over here. Aser to Aser. Es kol tvuas arecha hayotze hasana hayotze hasana shana shana. So what is Tes referring to? Tes is telling us, I got ahead of the abstract from Ches. I'm sorry. By Ches it says, Lo yivaker bein toiv l'ra v'lo yimirenu. So that's the parsha of Temura. V'im hamer yimirenu v'yahu usmarasoi yeh kodesh lo yigoyel. So this pasuk is a pasuk talking about a bechor. And it says over there by a bechor, lo yivaker bein toiv l'ra v'lo yimirenu. V'im hamer yimirenu v'yahu usmarasoi yeh kodesh. So it talks about the din Temura here by bechor. So here's where you see the connection from Temura to Bechor, because in this pasuk of Bechor it talks about Temura, and by Bechor is Iskus L'Maiser, because it says Aser to Aser is called Temura Sarecha Hayotze Shana Shana, and then it says Kis Maiser B'nei Yisrael Shayirim L'Hashem Teruma Nasati L'Lavim Alkein Amarti Lachem B'Seich B'nei Yisrael L'Yin Chalumach. So let's have a look over here at the psukim with. My timer, the iskish Temura l'maisha behema. So Temura and maisha behema, we see the connection because it says lo yivaker, and it says v'hayhu smurasai. Okay, and then the maisha behema is iskish l'maisha dogon because it says aser to aser, which is a double lashon. Right? We learned this in Yom Tov. V'yamar ma'av b'chayis aser to aser is talking about two different halachas of meiser. B'shnei meiser is a cost of davar. Echad maisha behema v'echad maisha dogon. So all maishas are compared to each other, and Ma'aser behema is so Ma'aser behema is ishkish l'ma'aser dagan, and Tamura is ishkish l'ma'aser behema. Because by Ma'aser observes, by Ma'aser is Vayihu Usmurasai. That was the pasuk that I missed out. By Ma'aser is Vayihu Usmurasai. So therefore, we have a similarity between Tamura and Ma'aser behema, and all Ma'asers are compared to each other. Ma'aser dagan, and by Ma'aser dagan we know Bnei Yisrael v'lo Oivdei Kechavim. The whole halacha of Ma'aser only applies to a Yid and not a Goy, because it says Kesmaser Bnei Yisrael is Shayum El Hashem Truma, which is referring to Ma'aser as well. So that, therefore, you know that just like by Ma'aser, that by Ma'aser Dagan, it's only given by a Yid, not by a Goy. So too Ma'aser Behema, and just like you know by Ma'aser Behema that it doesn't apply to a Goy, we'll say that Tamura does not apply to a Goy either. Okay, Gabalti. Freit the Gemara, v'chidavar halamud behekesh, koizer u'malamud behekesh. Don't we have a rule by Kochim that if you import a halacha through a hekesh, you can't export that same halacha to a third party with a hekesh? So how do you know that by Ma'aser Behema that it doesn't apply to a goy? You only know it because it's being compared to through a hekesh to Ma'aser Dagan. So Ma'aser Behema imported this halacha that it doesn't apply to a goy. So how can Ma'aser Behema now export this halacha to Tamura through a hekesh? It's something that it learned through a hekesh, it cannot transmit through a hekesh as well. Therefore, we're going to have to say v'chidavar halamed behekesh chayzu melamed behekesh zok Gemara Ma'aser Dagan chulun. You don't have to worry about it. You know why? Because Ma'aser Dagan does not have a kedusha. It has the din of chulun. And this whole halacha that if you import something through a hekesh, you can't export it, won't apply to here, because the source of everything is Ma'aser Dagan. That's where we learn it doesn't apply to a goy, and that's extended to Ma'aser Behema, which we then want to further extend to Tamura. Since the source of everything is chulin, that rule of davar lamed behekesh doesn't apply. Well, that's if you hold that it all depends on if the source is chulin or not. You're right. Here the source is chulin. But what if the rules reads differently? What if the rule reads you have to look at what you're learning too? There is a mandamar who holds that this rule that you can't import with a hekesh, something that was already imported, that's referring to the end user. It's referring to the last receiver. If the last receiver in this case is Tvura, which is Kachim, you can't learn it out of something that only knew it through a hekesh. Ella, therefore, will say that Ma'aser Behema, how do we know that Ma'aser Behema doesn't apply by a guy? Not because of the hekesh. Rather, there's an independent reason, Mineu Be in Ma'aser Behema, where we know that Ma'aser Behema doesn't apply to a guy. Ella Ma'aser Behema choiva she'en kavua lo zman. Ma'aser Behema is a choiva that does not have a specific time. There's no specific time we bring Ma'aser Behema, like a Korban Pesach. The choiva she'en lo zman kavua, and any choiv, it doesn't have a zman kavua, Yisrael Maisu and Oivdei Kechavim Lo Maisu. A guy doesn't bring such a korban. Now Rashi tells us that this whole thing is lavdafka. Rashi says that goyim could only bring the darim and the davos, but no korban chayva could they bring. So the real answer is that a guy is never subject to any type of korban chayva, such as Ma'aser Behema. So therefore, mineu bei in Ma'aser Behema, we know that a guy can bring it not because of a hekesh, and therefore Ma'aser Behema can pass it on to Tamura. So then the first question that we have to ask is, if what the Gemara is really saying is a korban chayva doesn't apply to a guy, so why is the Gemara mixing in about en kavul azman? En kavul azman is not the issue. So that's a little difficulty that we have to deal with. So let's see how Rashi deals with it. Oivdei kechavim loy maisu. Why not? The loy is rabu oivdei kechavim ella l'nedarim u'nedalos. So right away Rashi sets it straight. It's not exactly what you think from reading the Gemara. As a matter of fact, there is no korban chayv, whether it's kavul azman or not. A guy is never mechuyev on a korban chayv. A guy is only mechuyev, only as included in the halacha of nedarim and nedalos. K'dichsev v'kra l'chol nedreim. V'hu adin nami zok Rashi the loy maisi chayv akavul lehem zman. They don't bring any chayvus. It doesn't matter. Going oilas re'iyah v'shalmei chagiga, those are kavua lemzman. We bring them by Yom Tov. A guy, of course, has no chiyuv to bring those either. Ella loy psikalei. What is the example of a carbon chayva hakavua lemzman? The example will be oilas re'iyah and shalmei chagiga. So why didn't it say even those? Ella loy psikalei. They didn't want to say they don't bring oilers and shlomims because sometimes they do bring an oiler and shlomim of a nedava. Oilam avina oiler v'sham nedava. Of a meiser chatas v'asham loy shaykh klal, that a guy won't have any shaykhs to. So really it means they don't bring any type of carbon chayv. But since the carbon chayv of oiler and shlomim, they bring that type of carbon when it's not a chayv. So the Gemara didn't want to discuss that. That only adds 5 minutes to the complication. Gewaltig. Zog de heilige Gemara weiter. Ve'ein mevi in nesachim. Goyim cannot bring something called a carbon nesachim, where he's only bringing the wine. Tanu Rabbanon. Ezrach. It says in the pasuk Ezrach. So let's have a look at the pasuk. Is that a chaf maybe? I think it's a chaf. So what does it say over here? By the pasuk of Ezrach, Kol ha-Ezrach yasa kacha es ela lahakav isharech nechoich l'Hashem. It's talking about nesachim, and we learn Ezrach maybe nesachim ve'ein ha'ovid kechavim maybe nesachim. A Jewish citizen could bring nesachim, not a guy. As Rashi says, Ezrach beparshas nesachim ksiv b'shlach l'cha Kol ha-Ezrach yasa kacha. From this pasuk we will learn Ezrach malamed shemisnadvim nesachim umavim b'chnei atzma. That's where we learn that even nesachim not brought as part of a carbon, an independent standalone nesachim is something that a yid could bring, but not a goy. So Zok to Gemara, I'm sorry. No, they could pay for a Jewish wife. Yeah. Also, it's yain nesach only if they actually pour it to avoid zora. Stam yain because they touched it. That's there that came in the middle of the second base of mikdash, in the middle of the first base of mikdash. That the con happened, but it's not that they rise up. As a matter of fact, you might think, okay, if they don't bring nesachim as a standalone, even if they bring a carbon, it doesn't have to be accompanied by nesachim. The pasuk says this is exactly how the oil has to be brought, and it lists off nesachim that have to be brought. Kocha yasa l'shara echad or l'ayil echad or l'seven pasuk ma'izim, they have to have their nesachim. Okay, gewaltig. The gzera of stam yayin was accepted by all of Klal Yisrael in Yerushalayim, in Eretz Yisrael. Danny the other told me Italians don't hold of stam yayin. They could, just like you buy Coke and Pepsi in the grocery store and juices, they buy regular wine. They buy regular wine in the grocery stores. No hechsher required. Yes, and he told me because during the period of who destroyed, which base of Mikdash did the Romans destroy? The first or the second? The second? So he said during the period of the second base of Mikdash, the Anshe Knesset Agdayla saw that there's clouds on the horizon and we're going to be thrown out of Israel one day by the Romans. We better set up a community in Rome so that we have a place of refuge. So they sent a delegation of Yidden to move to Rome, which were the seedlings of the olive Italian Jewry today, and they have their roots back to the second base of Mikdash in Italy. And when Chazal in Yerushalayim was makabel upon themselves stam yain, those guys missed the WhatsApp. They never knew about it. They never accepted it. They never had to check zera. And atayoy mazeh, they drink stam yain. So Danny Dina told me, my father goes to the grocery store and he drinks wine. Wine in Italy, even for the Jewish community, is like Coke over here. And it's better than that because Coke needs a hechsher because who knows what ingredients are going in. But wine is like, they still have a pure wine when they get talking and they drink wine. So Danny told me that when his father came to America, to yeshiva, his Rosh Yeshiva told him, from now on, you keep stam yain. So you're not allowed to have stam yain anymore. So that he says, I never was able to have stam yain either because my father, he says, once you're in America and you're not in Italy anymore, you're prohibited from drinking stam yain. But Danny said, my grandfather always drank stam yain, no question. My father stopped when he came to yeshiva because they told him he had to stop. Okay. Zog to Gemara. So that explains a lot. What? They could drink a lot of wine. Zog to Gemara weiter. Rabbi Yosy. Rayani b'chulon lahachmer. Rabbi Yosy holds that all these halachas should apply to a carbon brought by a goy. Hamed dvar mamurim ven ver das gesagt bekachim is bayach. But by bedek abayis, all of these halachas apply equally to that of a goy. So Moti pointed out, what's this for? If anything, bedek abayis should be less chomer. Zog to Gemara, my timer. What is the reason? Kasovar Rabbi Yosy old he gamra meila chet mitruma. When we learned chet meila from truma to say that it doesn't apply to a guy, dumya the truma the kadisha kedusha saguf. What are we learning? We're learning from truma. Truma has kedusha saguf. So the whole makar to excluding a guy's korbanos from meila comes from a case of kedusha saguf. So therefore, only by the kedusha of kedusha saguf do we say there's no din meila. Ava kedusha bedek abayis, the kedusha damim loy. So it's just psukim. It's exeris hakosha. Zok to Gemara Tanu Rabbanan. Dam shenitma. Dam became tamei. Vizarkoi. And I guess the Kohanim didn't know that it was tamei for whatever reason, and because of that, b'shogig they spritzed it on the mizbech b'shogig. Hortza, it's a good carbon, and we know that tzitz is maratza on tumah in the base of mikdash. Not if the person is tamei, but if the kachim become tamei, the tzitz is maratza if it's done b'shogig. Okay, gavaltik. Dam shenitma v'zarka b'shogig hortza. But b'mezid, if we knowingly knew, the kohen knew that it was tamei, and he b'mezid spritzed, then loy hortza. It doesn't work. Zok Rashi, that's only a kanos of the Rabbanan. The tzitz is maratza, whether it became tamei, whether it's b'mezid or shogeg, the tzitz is maratza, no matter what. It's merely kanos of the Rabbanan. It's a knas. The question is, I don't understand. If it was really maratza, so what? Business is going to make a knas, you have to bring a new carbon? Is that not chulin nazar? How can they do that? Zok Rashi, v'loy sheyovi acher. Don't think you got to bring another carbon. Them came him to bezdin maslin laker davim in the Torah ulahavi chulin nazar. That cannot be allowed. Ella all it means is lahutra lahatir basar b'achiva aval bailam nischapu. The basar that of this carbon that the dam was spritzed b'mezid, even though it was tamei, no one's allowed to eat that meat. And this is what Shmuel taught us in Masechah Shavot. Okay, so that's what we have. This only applies by a yachid. But if it's a carbon tzibur, then bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid hurtza. So there's no knas, so to speak. What if it's the carbon of a goy? Bein b'shogeg uvein b'mezid loy hurtza. So now we're adding this concept that tzitz is maratza on the carbon that became tamei. That only applies to a yihid. It does not apply to the carbon of a goy. Another halacha that we haven't talked about in the Mishnah. Amur Rabbanan kamed Rapapa. So the Rabbanan said this halacha over to Rapapa, and he said, "Command like Rabbi Yosy. This cannot be consistent with the shita of Rabbi Yosy. The Rabbi Yosy ha'amar bechulam ani roya lahachmir. Rabbi Yosy said that the carbon of a goy is exactly like the carbon of a yid. It should also benefit from the ritzitzitz. Sometimes the chumrah has a kula twist to it. How do I tell you the like Rabbi Yosy? Because according to Rabbi Yosy, it should be like a regular carbon, and the tzitz should be maratza. No, don't say that. I feel tell me Rabbi Yosy. Even if you're like Rabbi Yosy, and all the halachas that's applied to a carbon of a yid equally apply to a carbon of a goy, but the tzitz maratza is still different. Shani also the Amar Kra lahem v'loy oivdei kachavim. When the Torah talks about the tzitz being maratza, the Torah makes it clear I'm only referring to that of a yid, because it says by the tzitz v'hoya al meitzach aharon v'nosa aharon savoyna kadashim asher yakdishu b'nei Yisrael l'chol matnos kachem v'hoyu al mitzchay tamid l'ratzon lahem l'fnei Hashem. That lahem is extra to tell you that this phenomena of tzitz maratza is something that applies exclusively to a yid. Lahem v'loy lo'avdei Amalei Rav Huna b'Reder Rav Nasan Rav Papa. So if that's the case, Elamayata Asher Heimak Dishim Hachanami Heim V'Loy Oivdik Chavim. Where does it say Asher Heimak Dishim? Zokt The pasuk daber al ha'ar l'bonav yinazru mikatche b'nei Yisrael v'lo yichalu Hashem katche Hashem katche asher he makdichim li. This is talking about tumah. So you tell me the whole Isser of tumah by kachim only applies. The whole Isser to work on kachim when you're tumah. Just speaking about when they're tumah. Asher he makdishim li. That's only if Klal Yisrael is makdish a korban. But if the guy is makdish a korban, there won't be any prohibition of tumah. Is that what you're saying? So you're saying that a tamei person is a lot of work on the korbanos of a guy. No one's going to suggest that. It's not learned out strictly from the word lahem, and then you'll say hey makdishim should also be mamayit a guy. We learn it from the word l'rotzai. It says l'rotzai lahem. Ritzui is something that ritzui is a concept that will never be applied to a guy. Ritzui is a Jewish concept. Rashi says, La b'nei artzah la kadosh baruch hu heim she'enoi misratza lahem. A guy could never be mekayim nirtza by the seder. Bavilik, we're bavilik by the Rebbe Shalom. I don't even know the English translation. Huh? That they're not protected by the tzitz. But it's not because the word lahem doesn't exclude them, but the word ritzui excludes them. Well, how does it attach to English words? Bavilik. Favor? Found favor. Yeah, that's a loose translation. So a guy can't get that extra boost. Anything that you would not be mechuyev for pigel on, nevertheless, you would still be chayiv noiser if it became noiser, umishum tamei, or if it became tamei. Chutz min adam. Dam is one of the items that we said you cannot pigel on because it's a davar amater, not a davar aniter. So if you ate dam that was from a pigel beheva, there would be no chiyuv kares. But all the other parts of a pigel korban would be mechuyev. So even though it's a part of the animal that you won't be mechayiv if you eat it, and it's pigel, but if it was noisha, you'll be chayiv, and if it's tamei, you'll be chayiv. Zok Rashi, what are the examples of these items? So we had it in the last parak. And to this parak, all of these items, which are matirim and not nitarim, those you can't be over pigel if you eat them, because they're the matirim. But if they became tamei or they became noisar, avada there would be an issue of tumah and noisar upon them. But dam, there's no din of tumah noisar, and there'll be psukim to teach us that. But Reb Shimon is mechayiv. V'davar shedar kan lecha. That's only something that's normal to eat, food items. Avala eitzim v'alevayna v'aktaris ein chayovin alei mishum. If you ate eitzim, you ate levayna or ate kataris, which are not edible items, so then there will not be a chiyuv of tumah. Okay, gewaltig. Now, the next Mishnah that we're going to learn is what Rashi here is commenting on. But our Gemara puts that Mishnah after a shtickle Gemara. So we're going to hold off on these Rashis. I would have thought that there's no chiyuv for eating something when you're tamei. Ella al davar sheyesh loy matirin bein la'adam bein la'mizbeach. Only if it's something that could be affected by pigel. For instance, it has matirin bein la'adam bein la'mizbeach, like a murin, like basar. I would have thought that there wouldn't be a chiyuv of tumah on that either. Why? There's actually a svara to make such a suggestion. Umba pigel, madach pigel, shahu bikavia. Pigel is nagea even on a korban chatos. A chatos means that there's this very, if you ate pigel b'shoigi, what happens if you eat pigel b'shoigi? If you ate pigel b'mezid, you're chayiv kares. If you eat pigel b'shoigi, what do? You bring a korban chatos, right? Like any iser that if you ate it, if you did the iser b'mezid, you'd be chayiv kares. If you did it b'shoigi, you're chayiv to bring a korban. What type of korban? Not a korban that you can go to the tuition committee and get a break on. You have to bring a real chatos. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. It's a very severe avera. So that's one chumrah that applies to pigel, is that you have to bring a chatos, not a korban oil v'yoret. And uveyidia achas. The halacha is by tuma. Remember, you have to be noida in order for it to be shogig. In order to be over shogig and bring a korban out of a yard for tumas mikdash for kedoshav, you had to know you were tummy. You had to forget, and then you found out again that you were tummy and that you were over, and that's when you bring the korban. But if you never ever knew that you were tummy in the first place, you don't bring a korban chatos if you violate a tumah. For that, we have other communal korbanos that take care of that. So by tumah, you only bring a korban chatos to be mechaper. First of all, you only bring an oil of the yair. You don't bring a regular chatos. And B, you only bring it when there are certain conditions met. You knew before, you knew after. By chatos, it doesn't make a difference. If you didn't know anything, you're totally bliss, and you ate meat. And you ate pigel. It doesn't matter if you never knew that it was pigel. It's something that's called in the very b'shogig, and you bring a korban for it. So that's what we diachas. And there are no circumstances under which pigel becomes mutter, but there is a very big circumstance under which tumah becomes mutter. Tumah b'tzibur, right? If Klal Yisrael became tumah, they bring the korban pesach anyway. So there's three huge kulas that tumah has that pigel doesn't. So madach pigel, which is so more severe than tumah in three ways, as we just listed. Nevertheless, ein chayav in love ela al davar sheyesh le matirin bein ladam bein milim payach. Nevertheless, pigel is still only limited to items that have yesh le matirin bein ladam bein milim to exclude a kmitza. Tumah shehi be'oil b'yard. First of all, it doesn't even bring a regular korban chatas. It brings that korban chatas that you can go to the tuition committee on. You have to have known you're a tamei before. You have to have forgotten that you're a tamei and then be involved in kachim, and then remember it again that you're a tamei. Too many loops to climb through just to be able to be mechayiv with his chatas. And v'hutra mechlala. Sometimes tumah is mutar lechatchila in the case of roy. So einay din she'einay chayiv ella al davar sheish lematirin bein l'adam bein l'mizbeach. The svara is it should also be limited to the same set of items that pigel is limited to. Talmud Leimer Asher Heim Makdishim Li. The pasuk includes everything. When it talks about tumah, it says V'lo Yechalu Hashem Kachi Asher Heim Makdishim Li, which is very inclusive, and therefore it will include all items that you were makdish. Okay, break the Gemara. Yochel miyad. I would have thought right away when you're makdish them, before you're makriv them, it will be a problem of tumah. Zok Gemara Talmud Leimer Yikrav. So let's have a look in the Gimel. It says in the Gimel over here, Emar Aleim L'Doy Reisechem Kol Ish Asher Yikrav. And he calls Arachim Alakochim Asher Tishu B'nei Yisrael Hashem L'Tumos Hayalav. So it says Yikrav to tell you that it doesn't apply unless there was craving. So let's see Rashi. Yochel Miyad. I would have thought Mishahuktashu. As soon as you're teharezu oila, you make something hektish. Mischayev alav biyad imachle b'tumah. You'll be chayev right away of machle b'tumah, even though you didn't go through the process of the korban yet. Unless you yikrav mikol zarachim, Rabbi Lezer mefarish leiv also. So he's going to explain what this means. So Frank Gemara, let's look at what this means in the pasuk. In the pasuk that talks about tumah, it doesn't say if you ate the tumah. It says ishasher yikrav mikol zarachim l'kodeshim. If you even get near kodshim, there's a problem of tumah, which the Gemara says, okay, getting near it probably means touching it. It can't be ulcer if you just got near it, right? At best, it means you touched it, but you don't have to eat it. So, Frank Gemara, you ever find somebody that'll be chayiv chorus if he's tummy and he touches kodshim? We only learn it if someone ate it, but if someone touches it, that's no one suggests that. So, elamatem yikra. So therefore, why did the Torah say that it only applies by Yikrav? It doesn't apply by Yikrav, it applies only by Achila. The Torah says, Yikrav v'huchsher likarev hakasav medaber. The only type of touching that the Torah is saying, if you ate it, you'll be chayav kares if it was huchsher likarev. Haketzat, yesh le matirin, if it's a davar yesh le matirin, like it's a korban, then mishayukrav matira. After the dam is spritzed, and now this basar is ready to be placed on the mizbech or to be eaten depending on the korban and where the meat is destined to go. That's when there's a iser to eat it with a chiyuv kares. But now, what if it's a davar she'ein l'matirin? What if it's Keteris, where there's no sampling of it, or it's the Kmitza, not a Davar Shleisha material, it is the Mater, so then Mishiyikdish Bekli, when it's placed into Klei Sharis, that's from then and on is when there'll be a Isser Karis to eat a Betuma, but not before then. So that's what the Gemara says. Yochel Miyad, you would have thought the moment you're Makdash Behema, it's going to become a Chiv Karis to eat it. Kamash Malon, the Chiv Karis only is triggered once the carbon is either processed or placed into a Klei Sharis. Okay, Gabalti. So now let's have a look at the Gemara Vayter. Ashkechon Tumah. So that's how we know that a Davar Tameh, there's no problem with the problem starts after it's hookah. Tuma Noisar Minolam. How do we know this rule applies to Noisar as well? Gemara Asi Chilul Mituma. This is the Xerish Shava that we've been using for the past couple of days. The word Chilul mentioned by Tuma, the word Chilul mentioned by Noisar tells us that they share the same Allah. Frank Gemara, the leil of oven mipigel. So if you remember, up until now, we were saying Tuma, the issue of Tuma applies to all animals. That we export to Noisar to tell us that Noisar also applies by all these different animals. And then from Noisar, we also exported it to Pigel. So you see, this is a double Xer Shavah that we're using to share all three, the share halachas from Tuma to all three things. But here we have a misnomer over here, because over here we have Pigel, which is different than Noisar and Tameh. And there's also Xer Shavah. So who said you should compare Noisar to Tuma using Chilul? Why don't you compare Noisar to Pigel using Avain and say that just like by Pigel, these things don't apply, so too by Noisar they don't apply. So I actually misspoke. So when the Gemara says Ashkechan Tuma Noisar Minalam, Tuma we see applies even if it's Pigel is limited. We said Pigel is limited to davar sheyesh lematirin bein laadam bein lemizbeach, right? So how do we know Noisar isn't limited as well to things that yesh lehem heter lemizbeach or laadam? So how do I know it applies to everything that Tuma applies to? So Aktimar, we learn it out of Noisar. I believe Avam Pigel. So Aktimar the Mistavra mituma havel elamelech. You have Noisar here in the middle. Should we compare it to Tameh, because you have Xer Shava, or should you compare it to Pigel? Zok to Gemara, Noisar shares more commonalities with Tuma than it shares with Pigel. Why? Shekain Gezel Simon. Rash's Gezel means guf. Noisar is a Tumas HaGuf. Tome is a Tumas HaGuf. Something happened to the item itself. Pigel, nothing happened to the thing itself. You had a machshava about it. Okay? Zion stands for Zrika. All these things happen, the Noisar and the Tame happens after Zrika. And Lamed, let me see if I can remember what these things are. So Rashi's Noisar v'Tama ein Zrikas Hadam Aviyas Malei Psulan, and the third thing was Zman and Chilul, and Lamed, it stands for Chilul. Sai by Noisar and Sai by Tuma uses the word Chilul. So therefore that's another similarity. So there's three similarities that Noisar shares with Tuma, which tells us you should compare Noisar to Tuma. I'll show you that Pigel has many similarities with Noisar that Tuma doesn't share. Shekain Hutter by Tuma, we found it's Hutter Ritzibur. Noisar and Pigel are never Hutter Ritzibur. Tzitz, we know that the tzitz is Maratz on Tuma, but the tzitz is not Maratz on Noisar, nor is the tzitz Maratz on Pigel. Tahar, they're both Tahar, right? The Noisar and Pigel are Tahar, they're not Tameh. And Bizman. So let's see what Bizman means. Bizman. Ushneim Nefshalom Bizman. That's right. Noisar, it becomes Tameh because it was left out for too long. And Pigel, you had a machshava about leaving it out for too long. So they're both Bizman. And Ushneim Psulim B'Karev Lafuke Tumos Haguf Shepsulim B'Makriv. That's right. So the problem with Tameh, there's no issue with the meat of the carbon at all. We're talking about Torah meat that's eaten by someone who is Tameh. So the problem is on the makrib, on the person involved. Mashayk and Pigel and Noisar, the problem is with the meat itself. Either the meat is Pigel or the meat is Noisar. And Bahani Nefishin, we have so many more comparisons to Pigel. We have Hutter, Tzitz, Tar, Bisman, and Kar. We have 5 similarities versus only 3 similarities. So Oibazoi, maybe the Isser of Noiser should be limited only to items that apply to Pigel, which are items that become Hutar. Ella Miditani Levi. So if we want to say that Noiser doesn't have all the Noiser applies to all these things, we have to use a different limit. The Tani Levi, Minayin Sha'af Beposel, Sha'af Bepsul's man, Hakasav Medaber. How do you know the Pasuk is even referring to a Psul's man? So let's hear Rashi. Minayin Sha'af Bepsul's man, Hakasav Medaber, Hakrad to be Ninasru. How do you know the Pasuk that talking about Tumah is also referencing Noiser as well, so that all of the rules of Tumah also apply to the halacha of Noiser, because in the pasuk of Tumah it says the Yechalu es Kachem B'nei Yisrael, and it says it by Tumah. Turning on to Amud Aleph, Bishnei Chilul and Akasav B'daber. Rashi says Midaloichsev v'Yinazru Ela V'lo Yechalu. But if you look in the Gersa, it says it could have said V'lo Yechalu with 1 lamed. It says V'lo Yechalu but Tumah with 2 lameds. To tell us we're talking Sai about the Chilul of Tumah and Sai about the Chilul of Noiser. And therefore, Echad Psul Noiser, Echad Psul Tumah, and therefore whatever the Psul of Tumah applies to, the Psul Noiser applies to as well. So therefore, you're Marba al Mukdoshim, and you're also Marba even things that are not Dover Sheish material. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll be tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm not here in person. Tomorrow I'm just going to be online. So what I'll do is I'll raise the volume of the television, because that's one mistake that we always have, is that you can't hear me. So I'm going to raise the volume right now. Okay, but I'll go. Yeah, my sister's making chasna Thursday night.